really happy to be able to speak to this audience and to present some work that I did actually quite a long time ago, a little more than 10 years ago. I did this field work in 2008-9. But the question I've asked here, I think, is still relevant. So therefore, I'm really quite happy to be presenting this work. Of course, the title, as you can see, is Civil Society Organizations, Local Government Politics, and the Mobilization of Women by Kudumbasree. What I'm really going to be focusing on is what I thought was a relatively unexplored, or a question that kind of lies hidden in the vast literature that now exists on Kudumbasree and microcredit, microfinance, but also this whole network issue, the fact that we've mobilized so many women into the statewide network. And that question is that how was this government program, the Kudumbasree program, actually able to mobilize women into neighborhood groups, thrift and credit groups, because fundamental or the very basis of those groups, despite the fact that they have a lot of other functions, the basic activity that they take up is thrift and credit. And the experience generally has been that it requires a lot of what is called hand-holding, which is mentoring and monitoring, really, to make these groups sustainable. But Kudumbasree was able to do that with a very small bureaucracy at the state and district levels. As you know, the bureaucracy of Kudumbasree is extremely minimal. It doesn't really have very many people. And it was actually able to mobilize these women across the state with very few of those people that it has in the mission. So how really, and it sort of, we assume that women came together because of certain other kinds of conditions in place. But we really haven't asked that question and tried to probe it. And that's what I'm going to be doing in this particular session. So, basically these are the issues that I'm concerned with in this paper. What enabled Kudumbasree to mobilize women into a statewide network of thrift and credit groups across much of Kerala rapidly and in a seemingly organic and painless way in a short span of time? And this is something, it's just assumed that, there were certain conditions in place, but we haven't really probed it, as I said. So Kudumbasree confronted the greatest challenges of mobilization of women on the socio-spatial margins. What do I mean by that? Regions where certain groups who are generally marginalized in our society reside, there Kudumbasree was not really very successful and still faces challenges in getting these groups, the neighborhood groups, to stay together. So among the scheduled tribes in the highland areas, the fishers in the coastal sector, and the urban poor in the slum, these were the most difficult terrains as far as mobilization went. So there were systematic exclusions of the scheduled castes as well, and some of the poorest households. When I was doing my field work, this was quite starkly apparent. I'm not very sure now whether they have really managed to cover ground, but I assume they have, because in fact the data that I've used in this paper is right up to 2020, and there has been ongoing mobilization over the years. So every year they've been continuously mobilizing. So when it was successful elsewhere, why did Kudumbasree confront difficulties in mobilizing among these clusters? So these are the questions I asked. Next. So, okay, so I've basically tried to tease out some of the assumptions in the existing work, which has prevented us from asking the questions that I raised in the last slide. So these assumptions are that some of the conditions for mobilization were already in place in Kerala. These were that women were already familiar with being mobilized, though not into thrift and credit groups, but mobilized otherwise, either through the literacy movement that actually brought a lot of women together, men and women, but more women than men, as volunteers, but also as learners. And then, of course, the People's Plan campaign that really focused on women, as well as a history of public action-led development. And if you're familiar with Robin Jeffrey's work, the face of that whole mobilization for public action would be women. So women's propensity for thrift, willingness to submit to authority, and ability to conserve resources, which would make them ideal subjects of thrift and credit programs. This is generally there in the development literature, that women are these ideal subjects, because being managers of households, especially among the poor, that they have a propensity for thrift. Of course, acquired, but it's there. But being part of a patriarchal society, they learn to submit to authority, and they're also able to conserve resources. And this really makes them very ideal for these kind of programs. And then these are, as we know, stereotypes, and stereotypes are self-reinforcing, leading to the reproduction of these qualities through socialization. So these are the kind of assumptions that have operated, which have sort of prevented us from asking the question and really examining, were these really the reasons, or are there reasons to think that actually it was something else that enabled Kudumbasree to mobilize, and not really this. Okay, next. Okay. Now, here I'm kind of posing counter questions. I ask, arguably, women may require more than these experiences of mobilization and the qualities like that of, propensity to thrift and being self-disciplined, etc., for sustainable thrift and credit activity. They must be able to function as, credibly as managers of, okay, I'm going to switch that off. As managers of savings and debt, not only their own, but also those of other members of groups. So two categories of skills could be crucial for sustainable thrift and credit group activity, without which groups could dissipate in the face of conflicts. Next. Okay, so I said there are two kinds of skills that they would plausibly need to really function sustainably in thrift and credit groups. Otherwise, those groups are likely to wither away or, break down in the face of conflict. So these skills are: one, a set of technical skills related to the management of savings and debt. This would include the laborious and meticulous skills of bookkeeping and accounting, premised on some amount of structured learning. And anybody who's familiar with these self-help groups and the kind of ledgers that they keep will know what I'm talking about. Not everybody can really keep them. They're quite complex, and they really need to learn how to fill them all in and to do so correctly. And I found during fieldwork that they were actually not, many of these groups were not filling these in. They would just keep very simple kind of accounts in notebooks. And sometimes before, and audits were just coming into being, before the audit, they would sit together and, somehow manage to fill these rather complex ledgers. So that's one kind of skill that really, that this kind of activity is premised on. Two, the less tangible competences associated with leadership, the ability to bring people together, to coordinate activity, and to take decisions in a mutually beneficial, transparent, and accountable way. And we're all familiar, when we're dealing with one another's money, there's always suspicion, there's always a sense that, oh, but I'm not so sure what happened to this, and any little rumor can spark off conflict and things can break down. So obviously these groups needed to be able to work in a way that elicited trust with one another, especially among the leaders, and that trust was not really easy to have, and therefore it required leadership skills. Leadership skills are crucial because they serve to resolve function. Oh dear, Bell, this thing has come up again, which means, part of my PowerPoint is going. Okay, let me see if I can actually. The PowerPoint has gone. I don't know, there's something else. Okay, let me try. Oh, yes. Okay, that's fine. This is fine. Okay. Okay. In the course of functioning, trust is likely to be called into question constantly and would need to be renegotiated and reaffirmed. Next. So the NHGs, that the neighborhood groups that Kudumbasree's groups, thrift and credit groups, are referred to as neighborhood groups and not as self-help groups. So the neighborhood groups were observed to be functioning well as thrift and credit societies as early as 2003. And this is from work that was done by Sunita Kadiala quite early. She says, in fact, she says this as criticism in a sense, because she says they're working well as thrift and credit groups, but the Kudumbasree groups were the whole program was initiated for community building purposes, and the other aspects were not doing quite as well. So with a minimal bureaucracy, learning was expected to coalesce organically through the coming together of resources available in the local context, in the local community. The early experiences of civil society organizations, and here I'm talking about the NGOs that also promoted groups, that mentored groups, suggest that training and close mentoring was a prerequisite for the transfer of these required skills. How then did the NHGs achieve these skills such that they did not dissipate, despite the fact that they had only a very minimal bureaucracy? So next. Now, I have a certain hypothesis for this to answer this question, and that's what I'm going to place before you here. Okay, so NGOs, I am proposing that the neighborhood groups gained traction and reached bank linkage with relative ease, where the CSOs were active in mobilizing. Let me see if my video can work. Yeah, okay. So were active in mobilizing SHGs and failed to do so where there was little or no CSO, that is NGO activity. Now, Kudumbasree benefited from drawing into its fold a critical mass of women who, as part of existing civil society organization affiliated groups, possess the skills and competences necessary for sustainable thrift and credit activity. This would also explain why Kudumbasree failed on the socio-spatial margins, where livelihood conflicts and resource scarcity complicated the task of mobilization, and stereotypes of women as ideal subjects of thrift and credit had much less traction. And I should add to this that in civil society activity was also much less actually on the socio-spatial margins. And now, to probe this hypothesis, I'm going to be using two sources of data. That's my own data, which I collected in the course of the fieldwork, but I'm also going to be looking at existing work, especially Sunita Kadiala's, the data she presents, and data from a report by Jacob John, I think, which was done for the Planning Commission in 2008. So Sunita Kadiala's work was published in 2004, so it was probably refers to 2003, and the other 2008 again. So I will also refer to these sources. So more than 4 lakh groups with a membership of more than 65 lakh women were there under, in thrift and credit groups, not just Kudumbasree, but including the civil society organization. And this is the data that I collected by, getting responses from as many civil society organizations that were engaged in the promotion of self-help groups, because the study that I did was done for NABARD, and they really wanted an estimate among other things. So this is from that data source. So you can see that this is a very large number of and if we were to actually look at the population and divide that into the number of households that existed, it would mean that there is almost saturation. And then if you discern that since this is a process of self-selection, and people who are well off, middle class and upper middle class particularly, would not be members as a member in a self-help group, you would see that it would be more than saturation. So obviously there were women who were members of more than one group, and this is something that I found, and this was the purpose of my study, that to kind of get a sense of how extensive was multiple membership, and there was quite extensive multiple membership. But that's aside from the point. Between 65 and 75 lakh households. At that point, this was to a 2011 census that I've taken, I think. And Kudumbasree reported 1,80,000 groups. So that is very, very extensive in this 4 lakh. Of course, the 4 lakh included also other government department and government promoted groups. At that point, there was SGSY, which is now the National Rural Livelihoods Mission. And there were several other government departments also that promoted groups, but the NGO groups or the civil society groups were up to about 70,000 in this estimate. So saturation point had been reached, and efforts to promote new groups merely remobilized women who were already members in one or other group. This was the view of NABARD district officials who I spoke to, and I spoke to them in all districts. So next. Okay, so the Kudumbasree program was scaled up across the state in 1998. Its beginnings, of course, go back to 1992 in Alappuzha municipality and 1994 in Malappuram rural. Nearly 10% of the civil society organization affiliated self-help groups were formed prior to 1999, as against only 3% of groups affiliated to government agencies, including Kudumbasree. So you can see that when it started, at least in this was from my data, from my sample survey. So you could see that there were older civil society organization promoted groups than those of Kudumbasree. So they had started earlier, and there were more groups in the NGO sector than in the Kudumbasree. And in my sample, about 40% of CSO affiliated SHGs and 62% of government affiliated groups were formed between 1999 and 2003. So you can see how rapidly the government affiliated groups, which are mostly Kudumbasree groups, are formed in the early years after Kudumbasree was upscaled. That's in 1998. So I've looked at 1999 and 2003, whereas the civil society organization groups had a much more gradual formation process. And a gradual formation process also suggests that, they were being skilled with much greater care. So a comparison of mobilization of NHGs in 3 districts, Malappuram, Wayanad, and Alappuzha, helps us to probe the hypothesis that I've taken up. And I chose these districts because of my own experience in the field, where I found that in Malappuram, there were virtually no Kudumbasree neighborhood groups that had actually reached bank linkage. And to reach bank linkage, you had to go through a process where you had to be graded by the bank, which means that you had actually developed certain skills, and it could happen only after about a year. So you had developed these skills, and the bank actually believed that you could maintain, you could take a loan and you would be able to repay that loan because you were adequately aware of savings and thrift activity, you were keeping your books the way they should be kept, etc. So that was an indication that you had these skills. But in Malappuram, I found that there were in some areas, there were no Kudumbasree groups at all, and particularly in the coastal areas. I actually went looking for them, but I couldn't find them. And when we tried to pick up groups for our own survey, we discovered we would pick them up and we would find that they either did not exist or they were not bank linked. They'd just come into being and they were not bank linked. So that was an issue. And then I also discovered that except in the 2 eastern highland taluks, that is Vandoor and Nilambur, there were no civil society organizations that were operating in Malappuram at that time. ISAF had just begun, and ISAF then was not a bank, it was still a self-help promotional institution, and it had just begun to promote groups, but I didn't really find any of those groups. So that's next. Okay, so here, this is a set of graphs that I have, which gives you the picture for Wayanad, Malappuram, Alappuzha, and all Kerala. This is with data from the Kudumbasree website, and I took it in 2020. And here, what I'm trying to show you is that in Wayanad and Alappuzha, you find that, the early years between mobilization, these are, I should mention first, these are annual mobilization. So it's not cumulative. So it's the number of groups that are actually mobilized from year to year. So you find that both in Alappuzha and Wayanad, the peak mobilizations occur very early on. In Alappuzha, it's 2002, 3, and in Wayanad, it's 2001, 2, that, you know, they have a spike in mobilization. And in Wayanad, again, you find that there is a second peak in 2012 and 13, but that second peak is actually on account of extensive mobilization of ST NHGs. So in the early phase in Wayanad, ST people were not really mobilized extensively, and that came up later. And if that ST mobilization is deducted, then the graph would be very close to what Alappuzha looks like in Wayanad. So you can see that mobilization actually occurred very early in Wayanad and in Alappuzha. Both, and I selected Alappuzha and Wayanad also because I found that these were two districts that had extensive civil society organization participation in the promotion of SHGs. And you can see that this pattern is also there. Whereas if you look at Malappuram, you see that the peak occurs much later. It comes in 2012, 2013, right? The spike actually comes there. And you can see that in the early years, up to 2003, 2001, 2, there's very little of mobilization. And then, you know, it starts. And of course, it's every year there is some amount of mobilization. And, also a work that was done by Jacob John, the report that I spoke about, when in 2008 says that he says that about 25% of registered NHGs that he found were dead. They didn't exist. And therefore, there was, you know, also withering away. But this data cannot tell you that. But all it can tell you is the fact that you continuously mobilize, because there still remains scope for mobilization, because groups are also withering away. But you can see that Wayanad and Alappuzha completely are really quite distinctly different from that of Malappuram. And I've also given you Kerala, which has two spikes reflecting the pattern that occurred, of course, across the state, but it also shows, you know, that there would be other districts as well that may be closer to Malappuram. But I didn't find that there were any other districts that was quite like Malappuram in the sense of lacking CSO activity over such a large swathe of its territory, the coastal area and the Midlands. It's only in the Highlands where they had civil society activity. Next. Okay, so this is basically what I'm just speaking from those graphs. So you can go to the next slide, Christabel. Okay, the formation of NHGs was smooth. This was the district district manager. What are they called? The DDM district, or DCM, is it? Kudumbasree Mission Coordinator, DMC, yeah. So the DMC of Wayanad, who I was speaking to at that point, and he said, because of the work done by the NGOs, of the civil society organizations. Now, Kudumbasree did not have to cut its teeth in mobilizing neighborhood groups because the NGOs had already done the difficult work for them. And this was a representative of one of the CSOs that was actually actively involved in promoting self-help groups in Wayanad. The DMC Malappuram admitted that mobilization lagged behind, and though there had been an intensive drive to make up for this, few NHGs had qualified for bank linkage. Now, he also said that when I asked him, you know, what the problems was, he actually blamed it on the previous UDF government. It was an LDF government at that time, saying that, you know, Islamic strictures against usury was one of the big problems. They had, in a Prajara and Kannada theatre, they were preventing groups from being formed. Okay, next. So this is a table, again, where I have used my own data, but also some data. The asterisk is from Sunita Kadiala, where you can see, you know, the number of groups that were mobilized in 2003 and then 2008. In Kudumbasree and also among the CSOs. And you can see here, the CSO data is from my survey. as is the December 2008 data from Kudumbasree. And you can see that Malappuram, there were very few groups that were mobilized by the civil society organizations. And this is because, as I've said, there was civil society mobilization only in the 2 Eastern Highland taluks. Whereas if you look at Alapura, you find that, civil society mobilization was almost at the same pace as Kudumbasree. Though, of course, Kudumbasree was mobilizing over much larger areas than NGOs. NGOs specialize in smaller areas because there are many of them and they choose where they want to work. And again, in Wayanad too, you can see that there was a significant mobilization by, a civil society organization. This is in 2008. But if you look at 2003 for Kudumbasree, it's even fewer, right? The numbers are very few, really. Compared to if you look at the CSO December 2008 data. But yeah, that's not a good comparison. Now, if you look at membership in thrift and credit groups, Kudumbasree and CSO, again, you'll see the difference because, I put this there because the number of members in each group differs. But you can see again in Alapura that numbers in CSO groups are, fairly close to that of Kudumbasree, though Kudumbasree is really a statewide program. Whereas in Malappuram, you can see how small it is compared to Kudumbasree. Whereas Wayanad, again, despite the fact that Kudumbasree is, a state program, you can see that there is considerable mobilization by civil society organizations. So, and this is to give you a sense of the population of these districts, because Malappuram's population is much larger than that of Alapura and Wayanad is particularly small, right? And yet the number of groups mobilized in Wayanad by a civil society organization was significantly large, and whereas by whereas in Malappuram, the number of groups mobilized by Kudumbasree was relatively small. So that's why I've given you the population share. So next. Now, in 2003, Malappuram had this is basically speaking from the last slide, but I'll just go over it. So in 2003, Malappuram had the lowest number of SHGs and membership in them, whereas Alapura had the largest number of SHGs and members in them. Wayanad had a substantial presence of NHGs in 2003 and 2008, whereas CSO promoted SHGs, as well as CSO promoted SHGs in 2008. Alapura and Wayanad were far ahead in CSO activity. And so that's a point that I did want to make. Kudumbasree mission in Alapura and Wayanad may have benefited from CSO mobilization. And there's a clear possibility, even when you look at the data. In 2008, Malappuram had a large number of NHGs, but this must be seen in proportion to its population. The absence of SHGs in all but the Eastern Highland taluks, blocks of Malappuram may have may have affected sustainability and bank linkage in NHGs. So what I want to say here is when you look at these numbers, you've also got to think in terms of, you don't have to have an entire group of NHG who are previously members of a CSO group. Even 1 or 2 members are enough to bring those skills in. So, even a smaller number of previously trained members by the civil society organizations who then migrate to the NHGs can actually affect the dynamic quite differently by bringing those skills in. Okay, next. Now, I want to pay attention to the pace of mobilization. And I already mentioned in a previous slide, showing that the pace of mobilization among the SHGs or the CSOs was much slower than that of the NHGs. So CSOs started small and expanded gradually, employing staff to mentor and monitor groups. And that's very clear in my field work, where, they had a large number of people they called organizers, etc., who were in the field actually working with these groups. Whereas that was not the case with the NHGs. So some of these CSOs had been engaged in development work in their respective regions for decades and had extensive social capital. Rasta and Wayanad began with 3 groups in 1993, and it took 3 years for them to move to double digits and 5 years to get to triple digits. From then, they were able to expand swiftly. This is what the executive director told me. So in the beginning, it was a real struggle, getting these groups groups on the ground, but more so actually getting them to believe that this was something that was useful for them and it was really going to have any benefit for them. So that was something that groups had to be convinced of. And so the NGOs really did the hard work of demonstrating that. So GSGSK in Alapura started development work in 1958, but had to reach out to a respected school teacher to start the first groups in 1997. This was a school teacher who later went on to become a panchayat president, and she was really very popular. And so because they were unable to manage on their own, they reached out to her to start their first group. And they needed intense mentoring and monitoring to sustain their SHGs. They said the staff had to be constantly out on the field, but once it, the demonstration effect took off, it was much easier. Next slide. So once the tangible benefits of group activity became apparent, a demonstration effect set in. Now, the two particular learnings from this that I want to stress. It had been a struggle for the CSOs to generate trust among women, to form groups, to take up and continue thrift and credit activity, and to demonstrate that it is indeed beneficial for them. CSOs were able to transfer skills and generate trust through a strenuous process of mobilization. So it was not easy for them. Unlike CSOs, Kudumbasree could not pick and choose where to work or to scale at what scale to do so. They had to work across the state. CSOs actually were able to pick up, to start work in areas where they already had social capital, and yet it was difficult for them. So you have to bear that in mind. Next. Now, data on multiple membership supports the contention of spillover of skills from CSO groups and NHGs to CSO groups to NHGs. Nearly 80% of groups that in my survey had at least one member who had membership in at least one other group. About 70% of additional memberships reported were with Kudumbasree. Though more members of SHG groups had multiple membership, and they were a smaller number of these groups, the additional membership was mostly with Kudumbasree. So a quarter of the groups had overlapping affiliation. 14% from Kudumbasree had overlapping affiliation. And what do I mean by overlapping affiliation? An entire group is affiliated simultaneously to Kudumbasree and to an NHG and to an CSO civil society organization. So it's the same group, but it is actually affiliated to two self-help promotional institutions. So as against 40% from CSOs, but 70% of overlapping affiliation of NGO SHGs was with Kudumbasree. So you can see that there was so much of sharing of membership. So whatever skills were really already created in the NGO sector, on the CSO sector, were clearly being routed to the Kudumbasree groups as well. Next. Now, going to how this whole, having these skills really is also reflected in the profile of bank linkage is what I'm going to address now. The NHGs, bank linkage and skills. So where CSOs did not promote groups, NHGs promoted by Kudumbasree were either sparse, failed to engage in regular thrift and credit activity, dormant. I found that there were groups that were dormant, hadn't conducted meetings and savings and thrift activity for a long time, and or had not reached bank linkage. And here I'm going to be looking at bank linkage because the other things I did not really quantify. So I did not sort of take into account in a systematic way. Only 32% of total NHGs in Malappuram were bank linked, and only 36% had been graded. So you can see that in Malappuram, again, I'm going to be looking at Malappuram, Wayanad and Alappuzha. In Malappuram, out of what we saw in the earlier table in 2008, out of the number that had been formed, only 32% had been bank linked. And what is bank linkage? They had taken loans from the bank, at least one loan from the bank. That is what you mean by bank linked. And prior to bank linking, you have to be graded. So 36% had been graded, which means they were in a position to take a loan. A bank would actually give them a loan. Thus, over 60% had not reached the required level of capabilities or of competence to take a loan from the bank. It's difficult to locate bank-linked, it was difficult to locate bank-linked NHGs in the coastal panchayats in Malappuram. The CDS chairperson of a Tirur Panchayat said only 10% of NHGs in the panchayat were bank-linked. So that was very, very small. But 88% of graded NHGs, out of those who were graded, only a small proportion were graded, 36%, but of them, 88% had received bank loans. So you can see that when it came to the graded panchayats, they were able to, they had taken loans. But then you have to keep in mind there were the two eastern highland taluks where there were NGOs working as well, right? And it's very likely that the bulk of these loans in that period, in 2008-9, had actually gone there. About 75% were bank linked in Alappuzha and Wayanad district. So that's a very large proportion of groups that were bank linked in the two districts that I've taken as for comparison. Next. This basically, you know, I've already read out the insights from this. It basically shows you, in addition, it shows you that in 2008, in Alappuzha, the percentage of graded NHGs, I mentioned the ones that had taken loans, but percentage of graded NHGs that had taken loans in Alappuzha, 99%, and in Wayanad, 90%, as against 88% in Kudumbasree. So it was even higher. But here I also want you to look at the amount of loan, you know, as a proportion of the total state, the loans that were given at the level of the state, the proportion of loans that went to Alappuzha and Wayanad in 2003 shows that it was disproportionately high, because given the population of Wayanad especially, nearly 20% of loans in 2003 went to Wayanad. And you can see that that's another indication of the high level of mobilization this was Kudumbasree groups, whereas it was very small in Malappuram, despite the fact that they had a very high share of the population. So next. Next, Christopher. Oh, I'm sorry, I just go back. Is there something I missed out? No, okay. You can, I'm done with this. Okay, so now I want to move to the last segment of my presentation. And here what I'm going to be looking at is what were the strategies that Kudumbasree used to mobilize women. As I've said, there were already women who were mobilized into NGO or civil society organization affiliated groups. So what kind of strategies did Kudumbasree use to mobilize women, given the fact that mobilizing women who were not previously mobilized into groups could be quite difficult and strenuous? So how did Kudumbasree, given the situation where, you know, you already had NGO groups, and I've already shown you data that suggests that, you know, there were overlaps, that there was sharing of membership, etc. How did Kudumbasree actually get these women who had previously been mobilized into CSOs into their groups, and also get those who had not been previously mobilized? So the process of mobilization of women under Kudumbasree was neither harmonious nor painless, but the experience varied. So where local government was dominated by the CPIM, there was hostility towards civil society organizations, and there was an aggressive effort to draw women away from the SHGs into the NHGs. Kudumbasree took the position that women must renounce previous membership in SHGs before joining an NHG. This was legally untenable, but created confusion among women about the legality of the NGO SHGs. And in fact, they referred to it as, you know, Angigaram illa enna pracharanam. SHGs le olla streegalku Angigaram illa. And therefore, you know, if you wanted to get state benefits, etc., you needed to shift to Kudumbasree. And that created a lot of fear among women. And there was a lot of confusion, which created a lot of distress. And women did migrate, sometimes leaving their CSO membership, sometimes not repaying their loans. So it created a lot of confusion and distress at the local level. Kudumbasree and membership in groups okay, so this was another element. In fact, Kudumbasree in Malappuram in particular, where they were, quite bent on trying very hard to mobilize groups. It was a key resource person who said this to me. He said that, you have to see civil society organizations as distinct from caste associations. And Kudumbasree takes the view that it's all right to be members of caste associations, because caste associations are actually things that bind people in more organic ways through marriage, birth, rituals, death, and so on. And so we can't possibly, de-link people from them. But CSOs are different and they have agendas. So Kudumbasree and, the state program is really directed at stopping this kind of link in terms of membership. Next. Where the left parties did not have a stranglehold over the local bodies, or community-based political forces had a strong voice, NGO SHG members were accommodated in NHGs. So, it was basically the hostility was where the left political parties were dominant in local politics. Whereas in local politics, if it was other, political parties, like in Malappuram, it was the Muslim League, there this kind of difficulty did not exist. But, in Malappuram, there were other reasons also for why mobilization did not take off. And that was because there were not any CSOs that were working in this area. And part of the reason was that the Islamic strictures on usury, because in the Midlands and the coastal areas, the Muslims are predominant in the population. And the Eastern Highland Taluks, it's Christians who are dominant in the population. And Christians have a lot of CSOs that were engaged in promoting self-help groups. So Kudumbasree officials even acknowledged the contribution of CSOs in easing the mobilization process. This was particularly in Wayanad. A Kudumbasree DDM acknowledged the promotion of groups was eased by CSO activity and joked that they would be the ones to lose members if they sought to prevent women from participating in CSO groups. So he said, "Njangalayirikkum prashnathilava anganenganam parnale avunde തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും ഞങ്ങൾ അങ്ങനെ ചെയ്യത്തില്ല." And there is a very easy and relationship of mutual benefit. So there were also other kinds of reaction. For instance, in part of Ernakulam and Alappuzha, there was resistance by women in a particular CS. So this was Win Society, which paid great emphasis. It was a church-based society, and it was convent sisters who were running this organization, but they paid a particular attention to political empowerment. And they had been giving classes to them, SHG members, and many of them had contested elections at the local level and even won. So their women stood up against the Kudumbasree's, intolerance at the local level. And they said, we know how to get our entitlements. If you're going to tell us we will be deprived, we know how to get it. And they even dared the panchayat officials to pay off their loans if they wanted them to shift. They said, we have loans here, you pay it off and then we will think about it. So next. In the coastal region, Kudumbasree faced its toughest challenge in mobilization and arrived at selective accommodation with civil society organizations, or at least did not try and weaken these civil society organizations, because they tried initially, but they realized that this was a completely different kettle of fish. And in the coastal areas, the conflict kind of overtakes everything else. And therefore, they really did not have the resources to put in for mentoring and monitoring the kind of effort that it takes to mobilize them. And therefore, here in the coastal area, CSOs where they existed were given free play. Irrespective of the political configuration at the local level, CSOs were active in promoting and nurturing groups in the coastal area. MACTRA was a CSO that worked in the coastal areas of Kozhikode. Its head said that groups were not denied welfare benefits, and knowing the difficulties of promotion, Kudumbasree did not interfere where MACTRA was active, and MACTRA didn't really go in where Kudumbasree was promoting either. But there were others like the Tiradesh Matsya Torilali Federation, I think it was called, where they were actually skilling and mentoring groups that Kudumbasree had promoted. So there was a accommodation, different kinds of accommodation that were reached. Next. MACRA promoted 6 groups, and you can see the difficulty here in promotion at the in the coastal areas. MACRA promoted 6 groups in 2001 and trained them over 2 years. They had formed 84 women's SHGs at the end of 2008, of which less than half were bank linked, and even fewer had started micro enterprises. Now, in 2008, a new standardized bylaw came out for Kudumbasree, and which constituted membership in NHGs as a right. So they could, the Kudumbasree officials also told me that they could no longer use that old tactics. Previously, there were different bylaws for urban and rural areas, and panchayats were allowed to make changes in them. That's how the Kudumbasree had come up with this thing that if you're part of an NGO SHG, then you cannot join the NHG. You have to renounce that membership, and only then can you join the NHG. And if you don't join an NHG, you will not be entitled to welfare benefits. So next. So now this is the last slide, I think, where I'm just going to very quickly go over the kind of implications of the strategy that Kudumbasree adopted. Kudumbasree was not oriented towards mobilizing groups in areas where it was difficult to do so, which were also regions with a pronounced deficit of development. The scheduled tribe concentration areas, the coastal areas, where livelihood conflicts were very stark, but also among SC scheduled castes who were dispersed, and also in the urban slums. That was also an area where mobilization was found to be very difficult. So, and Kudumbasree did not put in extra effort there. So of course, in some of these areas, like in the urban slums, there were no NGOs also. So these areas were completely left out of this process. So it may not have been reasonable or even ethical to address these social groups in a one-size-fits-all mode. Kudumbasree needed to develop a set of tools that would be honed to their social and economic distinctness. In fact, this was recognized in the Attapadi Tribal Inclusion Project by the NRLM, which was initiated in 2014 under the NRLM in association with Kudumbasree, and acknowledged upfront the glaring failure of Kudumbasree to mobilize scheduled tribe women. So there were very few scheduled tribes in the Attapadi tribal area who were members of Kudumbasree at that time, and those who had been mobilized at some point had withered away. So in recognition of this, the central government program came in, and they started mobilizing with a very different model, in which this compulsion to save every week was sort of reduced. They could save when they had earnings, but at other times they didn't have to. But more than one woman could be a member of the group, etc. Next. Yeah, I'm through. So thank you.